see if this now advances. Yes, good. The title of the workshop is Better Data, Policies, and Outreach. There's been an expansion of attention to a food system approach, very much in regarding sustainable development and sustainability, but in particular to climate change. So this is demonstrating that there used to be a big focus just on the production side, really, crops, livestock, aquaculture, and fisheries. But now in the field of particularly of climate change and agriculture and food, we're now looking at a food systems approach, including processing, value chains, markets and trade, demand, consumption, diets, food loss and waste across all of them, and then how they circle back to each other. We had a wonderful discussion earlier today on the circular agriculture, for example. In the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, new estimates were made on the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. So earlier ways of calculating this looked at agriculture with within farm gate alone. It looked at the role of agriculture in forest and other land uses. That's the FOLU part. That's clearing land for agricultural production and draining of wetlands. But the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land added a new category to the food system's emissions. Previously, they had been in other categories, as you'll see, but considering the whole food system is what this really is about in regard to estimating food systems emissions. So the pre to post production is a new category within the food systems emissions. So what we found in that chapter, working with that chapter, was that it's about 21 to 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the whole food system, not just from agriculture and land use, but from storage, transport, packaging, processing, retail, and consumption. Now, this is, I think, very important. We think very important new approach, but the uncertainty in these estimates remain high. So we have started, and you'll see the partners with AgMIP FAO, Columbia School for International and Public Affairs, and New York University, a new project with support from David Wallerstein for support of the project on food systems emissions. The rationale for the project is that this integrated systems approach with improved technical inputs is needed for countries to design effective, not only mitigation, but effective mitigation and adaptation strategies centered on food and agriculture. The objectives of this project are to improve estimates of food systems emissions and create country-level databases using a food systems approach. From the beginning, we're conducting policy analyses as to help countries achieve effective food system mitigation, linked to both international, such as the nationally determined commitments, NDCs, and domestic policies, for example, dietary guidelines. And also from the get-go, we are using social media tools to promote a broader awareness of food climate linkages using a food system approach. These link to the action part of the AgMIP8 week of we're really working to take what researchers are doing and carrying it forward to action. These are the project participants who are going to be leading the sessions, presenting keynotes and talks, and leading our breakout sessions today. I won't say they're all names. All their names, but you're going to see them. You're going to get to know them throughout this workshop. But thank you to everybody. We have a fantastic team working on this project. So, what are our goals for this afternoon? First, to share progress of the food systems emission projects with AgMIP and the broader community. We very much want to receive feedback on the methods and approaches that we're using. And we want to also prepare and disseminate a workshop report. So we're going to be capturing all your comments, all your questions, Q&As, and really with this, everything we learned from the participants of this workshop, create and disseminate, again, taking this to the broader communities to, we hope, lead to accelerated action. So very quickly, what are we going to do together this afternoon? We're going to start with plenary talks, one from Francesco Tubiello from FAO and one from Philippe Benoit. And then we're going to have some right away turn to you all for questions coming up on Q&A. So we'll get interactive right after the plenaries. Then we're going to have a session on the food system emissions by activity that we're working on specifically in the project. One is on energy within the farm gate, improving those emissions estimates. Another is on transport, and a third area is food waste. Then we're going to have an introduction to policy, which is very much the intertwined part of our of the project. And then we're going to have breakouts. And these are science and policy, again, in this intertwined approach. The first one is dietary demand and competition for land. The second one, and that's going to be led by Matthew Hayek from NYU. Science into policy action, both international and domestic strategies, led by David Sandalo. Energy, ag, and food chains. Francesco, it's getting late for him in Rome. That's going to be led by Philippe Benoit and Kevin Carl. And Matt's going to be moderating all of that. Then we're going to just at the end say, what have we learned, closing remarks, and intention setting for next steps. Now, we have a nuts and bolts. Eric Menkos, I know if I don't say this, he's going to jump in. So there are a lot of people registered for this session. If it gets to be very big, we won't be able to have more than 300 in any one of the breakout groups. I think it's probably, we'll see. I think that's maybe a aspirational goal that we would fill up all 300 sites in one breakout group. But if you can't get into the breakout group that you would like, please just go to another one. You'll be learning something and contributing something, I know, in any of them. So thank you for that. These are the breakout questions which we will address later. So I want to now turn to introducing our plenary talks. And let me see if we have our first speaker, if Francesco is on. Yes, he is.
Yes,
very good. All right. So, but first, actually, I'm going to introduce both Francesco and Philip, so we can just go share screens. When Francesco is finished, we'll go straight to Philip. So I'm very happy to introduce Francesco Tubiello, who is a senior officer at FAO. He is team leader of environmental statistics. And his main areas of expertise is in assessing the linkages between agriculture, food security, and climate change. At FAO, he leads data collection, analysis, and dissemination of databases, including land use, fertilizers, pesticides, ag environmental indicators, and greenhouse gas emissions. Very germane to the workshop at hand. But beyond the FAO, he's a member of the UN Committee of Experts on Economic Environmental Accounting. He's also a member of the UN Expert Group on Environmental Statistics, IPCC lead author, played a very, very strong role in the chapter on food security in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. So that is Francesco's introduction. Philip Benoit is an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, where he leads the center's Energy for Development Research Initiative. He's a senior associate with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He worked at the International Energy Agency as division head for energy environment, and for 15 years was at the World Bank. So it brings very much a development perspective to our project. So with that, I'm happy to turn over first to Francesco and then to Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let me share my screen first of all, so we can get started. Do let me know when you see it.
You can see it. It's not on slideshow yet. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for both introducing the project and for the nice introduction. You forgot to say that I was a crop modeler originally with you, which is how we got started on this long adventure. And welcome, of course, to all the participants and for giving us the time to listen to this activity, which is very much linked to the AgMIP, I think, overall interest, but of course, sits in an area, mitigation and greenhouse gases, that it's the opposite end of the impact adaptation work that I'm sure many of you have been drawn into when you got into the AgMIP work, perhaps. Okay, so what I will do is, Cynthia already gave some introduction to the rationale of the project. I'm gonna dive into data and also try to give you a flavor for the connections between the science work that we do as scientists that Cynthia has highlighted, and sort of the UN statistical world where this, where my contribution to the project lies, if you will. So just to go very, very quickly on the project goals and the rationale. So the main players at the moment are Columbia University and AgMIP through that linkage, NYU and FAO. And so as Cynthia had explained, we have started a project, and we're just in the midst of it. I mean, we began a few months ago, with the idea of, everybody knows that there are important emissions beyond the farm gate and the land use connected to those activities. But the actual quantification of those emissions in detail and by country is still lacking. Right? And so that's the adventure where we have embarked ourselves along in this project, with the idea that without that kind of detail, granular detail, what happens, over time and in different regions and by country, you don't really have enough information to develop effective mitigation policies and solutions to the climate change problem pertaining to land. And so this is in a nutshell why we're doing this, apart from, of course, enjoying it in its own right, because we've been working on this for so many years. So before I go into providing some flavor of the kind of work that we're actually already doing and where that is going, let me step back for a second. I just have a slide on this, and hopefully I won't speak too much about it. To provide a flavor for the if you will, more United Nations statistical world that comes into this, right? As Cynthia said, I work now at FAO, where I lead the work on agricultural agro-environmental statistics. And this is work that sits at the interface between science, because in a sense the database that we produce provide a global knowledge base. It's free and available for free to all users, and they are ingested into many high levels scientific reports, either directly using our data or with our contributions as authors. So some of these databases have a strong scientific value at a minimum, because at the level of details and with the global coverage, they are the only ones in town. And of course, we strive to improve them continuously, and in collaboration with academia. And on the other opposite end of the spectrum, these are the results of a dialogue between us, headquarters of the UN Agency on Food and Agriculture, and our member countries. So they actually have a duty to report data to FAO, and they do so every year. So it's a bona fide international reporting process that's been in place for many decades, and through which we receive information on many aspects of agriculture. The ones I'm in charge of, as Cynthia said, deal with chemical and organic inputs into the soils, the characteristics of land use. And then, as the title of the slide indicates, we also try to develop a number of analytical products to help countries, to help facilitate countries' requirements to report information on basically two important processes. One is the Sustainable Development Goals, where agriculture, occupies an important component in terms of sustainability within the farm and of food systems. And the other one, of course, is the climate change process. And so what we do there is we, if you will, leverage on the data that the countries give us every year, and which we consider part of our, let's say, official statistics. But then we use those to create new information. For example, emissions that come from agricultural activities in their own rights, number of livestock, management types, types of crops grown, amounts of fertilizers input into the soil, and so on and so forth. So we produce information that doesn't exist at the country level, at least in the FAO process, and we transform it into a number of domains, and you see an example in the slide. They seek to provide, first of all, simplified information, though robust enough to be credible, and that's typically under the banner of the Tier 1 IPCC methodology. It's something that the countries can look at. For example, many of our developing country partners don't have the capacity to elaborate this data themselves, at least at the beginning of the process. So they either can, use the data from us to be able to participate in the international reporting process. And the participation, keep in mind, is important for them because good data reported to the international community and the international process means also credibility, and also then importantly funding back to the country, right? And then as they progress along the path, and as they are able to produce strong databases themselves, they can still use our data as a sort of reference, if you will, statistically speaking, an instrument to do QA, quality control, quality analysis, to see what are the consistency of the data that they themselves elaborate versus the ones that they have communicated to FAO. So with this slide, I would sort of close that connection, but basically to say that the value, at least from my perspective, of working with the three partners is provide the use the science from academia, and then provide a niche or a platform for its use in the international processes that are linked to the UN. And so this sort of provides it's a very good combination. Now, let me then jump into the data proper, because I wanted to give you a feeling for where we are, or at least where we have been prior to the big effort that was launched last year with the special report on the climate change that Cynthia led. And also for give you a feeling for why it is important to collect data with a certain granularity, right? So it's certainly important to assess what happens at the global level. So here you see an estimate of what emissions from agriculture, meaning crop and livestock activities within the farm gate amount to. And now I just want to give you a general feelings for what the numbers are. These are numbers from 2018 from the FAUSTA database. And so we know that globally agriculture emits about 5 billion tons in CO2 equivalent. And having a database that provides this information by country, then you can aggregate in over time. You can aggregate in many ways to hone or to key in into important storylines. You can see here one of the things that you can do, the easy ones, of course, are to provide a regional disaggregation story on where those emissions are mostly generated. But let's keep in mind that 5%, because that 5 billion, because that's sort of the entry story into the the importance of agriculture activities into the mitigation story, or say at least into the emission story. So if you look at these from a CO2 equivalent perspective, those emissions are about 10% of the total emissions that we as humans put in the atmosphere every year. Right? Those are about 50 billion tons today. So that's an important contribution. It's 10%. It seems small, but it's actually already the second or third largest sector that emits into the atmosphere. That the largest one, and I'm happy that Philip will follow my talk, because the largest one is of course energy and the use of fossil fuels for energy. But there is there are other angles to look at these numbers, and one particularly important angle is to realize that the emissions from within the farm gates are basically non-CO2 emissions. There are emissions of N2O, nitrous oxide, very important gas that linked to the use of fertilizers, mostly applied to soils, both synthetic and organic. And from that perspective, the weight of agriculture over the total human activity is already, fundamentally high. We're talking 70% of total N2O emissions emitted by humans into the atmosphere come from within the farm gate. And then if you look at methane, another key emitter within the farm gate, this instead largely linked to the digestion processes of ruminants, livestock within the farms. That's already a very important contribution. It's about 50%. Now take these percentages at face values. I'm putting them here to provide you with a sense of the relative importance. These numbers vary year by year. They depend on how the global warming potential that you use. Sorry. Okay, so that's the interactions that we get when we are in teleworking. I hope you excuse me for that. So anyway, so these are basically the relative contribution of agriculture within the farm gate. Now, if we move on to the next step, and so we move beyond the farm gate. So I'm adding, piece by piece, the emissions that are making it into the database, starting with what's already in FAUSTA. So agriculture emissions were already in FAUSTA, and so are the ones about land use, right? So the most important emission that's related to food production beyond the farm gate is the emissions that come from deforestation, right? Deforestation that is particularly important in Africa and the American continent. I mean, you see Americas there because it's, you know, something we like to do in FAUST, that aggregate things this way, but the deforestation numbers you see, they are of course coming mostly from South America, and particularly from Brazil. And so you start seeing, you know, that there are components of emissions beyond the strict farm level activities that need to be considered when when the interest is to associate a climatic impact to food. And so you see that emissions from the deforestations are also substantial. And then if you add another component that it's important, and it's come to the fore of our attention only in the last decade, I think, prominently, and in particular over just the last few years. This is emissions that come from peatland degradation and fire. So they're very substantial globally, but they are coming from two major areas of the world: tropical Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, and tropical Africa. So these are emissions that are linked to the need to drain soils for agricultural production. These soils are typically wet, so they're soils that facilitate the formation of peatlands. Peatlands are very rich carbon stores. When you take the water out, it's basically like taking a cork off of a bottle, and CO2 just starts coming out. There are particular food systems that are associated with these practices. You may all be familiar with, but just to name a couple, are oil palm plantations in Southeast Asia, and cocoa and also oil palm in Central Africa. So what happens in this case, when you sum these two components, agriculture and land use, you already get to an important contribution of, agriculture extended, if you will, to world emissions. We're talking about 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emitted per year, which is close to that 20%. So that the lower limit that Cynthia was referring to in terms of the total estimate of food system emissions to the total that we emit today. So if you look at this graph here, provides you by continent, so each color is a continent, and it provides a say timeline from the year 2000 until present. It basically gives you a sense for the importance of the contribution of agriculture and land use to the total emissions. Okay, so globally we are today, we started about 30%, we are today about 20%, but this has a huge range depending on where you are in the world. In Africa, for example, it can be, it's already as high as 60%. And in fact, in some African countries, it can get as high as 90%. So you start to characterize not only the importance globally of the process, but also, its relative importance in different parts of the world. Okay, so now let me add, because I am very happy already by this time to be able to present some of the results of the project, because you'll hear it more in the following session from the people that have actually worked on this, on the additional food system components. Where we are today already in FAUST, not yet available to the public, but already in our test site as of last Friday. So again, this I think was the first milestone achievement for the project. We've been able to add emissions along that food system continuum that Cynthia has been talking about, and in particular, adding a quantification of emissions from waste, and you'll hear more about this from Kevin, but this includes a subset of what we intend for food loss and waste. That has to deal with food waste disposal, incineration, dumps, and wastewaters, and so on and so forth. So that's a component that we didn't have before, and that now is available over a time series and for all countries in the world. Same thing for on-farm energy use. That means that energy use component that it's typically doesn't make it into an agricultural greenhouse gas inventory when countries report that to the Climate Convention. And so you see, here actual results that start telling an interesting story. I mean, I didn't make yet any further analysis of this, but you can see already that just these two components already provide about add another 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalents emissions to the food system, ensemble of emissions, pushing already beyond that 20% that Cynthia was mentioning as the lower level estimate of the weight of food systems emissions in globally speaking. So yes, so this is our starting point. I mean, the one that gave us the rationale to move to this project. And these are the estimates that already Cynthia talked about. But you see here, more or less, and I said take the numbers that you've seen in the presentation at face value, because, for example, if you use the most recent global warming potential values, agriculture moves from 5 to 6 billion tons of CO2 equivalents. But we're talking something in the range of 10 billion tons of emissions per year. But then the pre and post production emissions are, estimated to be in a range of, up to 50% of the total. So with the two components, we're already close to the lower part of the range. We at the very, very beginning, so we're sharing with you where we are at the moment, and the breakout groups are also meant for us to get feedback from experts like you, also in terms of where you think AgMIP could contribute to the modeling that you are involved in. And so I think I will stop here. I mean, Philippe will talk very pointedly about energy use in agriculture beyond the farm gate, along the supply chain, but also at the consumption level, is going to be the most important component that we will add to FAUSTAR beyond the work that we've already done. And so let me just summarize what we've covered. So Cynthia already did. So this is a presentation of where we are, the kind of activities that we are planning from a data side on the project that I started recently between the partners that are all involved here. We think that the information will be fundamental in moving forward the dialogue on identifying mitigation actions, and therefore better drive and inform policy. And the most important thing is that we're already, moving well along this pathway, and we do think that we will have a full food systems database ready by early next year. So with that, Cynthia and colleagues, I thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to Philippe.
Great, thanks, Francesco. Maybe if you exit the share screen and I'll start mine. Great, so what I'll be focusing in on are really two related aspects. The first, as Francesco said, is to talk about the issue of energy. But the second is also to look at this issue of food emissions in a dynamic context, taking into account what's happening in terms of our development efforts. And as Cynthia mentioned at the beginning, at the Center on Global Energy Policy, I lead the Energy for Development initiative. So very much looking at this agriculture food issue from an energy perspective, but also looking at it very much from a development perspective that also builds on my previous experience at the IEA and very much at the World Bank. So one thing is when we come back to this issue of the farm gate and the like, there are always these wonderful pictures that I always find very interesting that show the variety of sources of greenhouse gas emissions on farms. And what we see hidden in here is a little tractor in the picture on the left, also repeat on the picture on the right, and the farmhouse. So we don't really see a lot of energy depicted here because there's so much more other forms of greenhouse gases that are taking place. But clearly, from the combustion of fossil fuels, there is a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are taking place on the farm gate. And I think the other point that's very important to recognize is the important role of energy in terms of producing food. And that, obviously, there are over 7 billion people in the world, and one thing they all do is they all eat, and we all need to eat, and a critical element of poverty alleviation is really improving the quantity and the quality of food that people are eating. And I'm going to come back to this issue because it's very much important when we think about what is happening in terms of energy for food and support of development. Now, as Francesca mentioned, agriculture is the second largest contributor in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's reflected in this graph here. You see agriculture is the line below 9.5 gigatons, but energy is the largest contributor in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. And I think the important point that we are trying to look at more deeply in the context of this research initiative is to understand what portion of those energy emissions are actually related to food. And again, looking at it from the integrated food systems perspective that Cynthia had mentioned. And I think what we find is there's a lot of energy in food at various steps in the process. So on this diagram, when we look at the inputs, fertilizers, manure, pesticides, the manufacturing of those products involve fossil fuels, both as feedstock and also in terms of their preparation, their transport to the farm. So even before anything has happened on the farm, a fair amount of energy has gone into producing the inputs that are then used on the farm to produce the product. But then we have the whole issue in terms of how the food or the agricultural product moves from the farm to our stomachs. So there's a whole processing dimension here, a packaging dimension, transfer to supermarkets and the like, a refrigeration there, transfer to our homes, cooking in our homes, use in restaurants, and waste disposal. So the important point that I wanted to sort of make using this slide is, while on the one hand, when we think about food, a lot of time there's a tendency to think about food production within the farm gate, what's happening in terms of agriculture, changes in land use patterns to support that food production. But when we look at this more profoundly from an energy perspective, what we see is that energy is being consumed along the entire food value chain. And unfortunately, given the fact that so much of our energy at this point is fossil fuels, that obviously has a big emissions impact. Now, this is an area that has not really been analyzed sufficiently from our perspective. It's a very complex area, and there's obviously always opportunities to do more, but some analyses have been done. And what you have here is the results of an analysis that was done for the United States by the US Department of Agriculture. And what you see again, reflected in the red box, are the different stages of the food value chain, from farm production and food processing to packaging, transportation, wholesale retail, food services, and then what the households consume. And I think what's important to recognize here is that you don't even have here the pre-production dimensions that we were talking about in terms of manufacturing the inputs that are needed to grow the food. What we see in terms of the results of this study was that about 13% of energy consumption in the United States in 2012 related to food. And then the other important point is when you start from the bottom, you see 1.4 BTUs for farm production, 2.2 for food processing, and then after that, you've left the farm gate. And so that represents about 35% of the overall total. So what this analysis from the USDA in terms of looking at the United States points to is the fact that most of the energy that is consumed as part of our food system is actually not consumed within the farm gate, but is consumed after the farm gate and actually potentially even before. What you have here is what that distribution of energy used for food looks like. Agriculture production, again, is 20.8%, and much of it is outside. But the one point I wanted to draw your attention to is that a lot of energy is consumed by households for cooking. So you have this point, home refrigeration and preparation representing, in this particular case, about 30% of food production. Now, this is in the United States, and obviously we would expect this figure to look different in, for example, a poorer developing country or an emerging economy. But one of the important points here is the following, is again, food preparation represents an important part when it comes to the use of energy on the food system. And this very much dovetails into another issue when we're thinking about energy for food. And that has to do with the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, where universal access to clean cooking is one of the major objectives and is also one where we are seeing, unfortunately, too little progress. There are about 2.6, 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean cooking technology. Now, in some sense, when we think about the issue of energy, food, and emissions, maybe we tend not to think about clean cooking technologies. But it is obviously critical in two important respects. The first is how people cook actually has an impact on emissions, which is not to say that there are large amount of emissions, but still it has an impact on emissions. And then the second thing is that fundamentally, from an overall development perspective, we need to address this critical issue. So we need to address the development imperative and the sustainable development imperative by dealing both with the issue of providing clean cooking as well as the issue of addressing emissions. Well, interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, the IEA did a study in terms of what would be some of the impacts of achieving universal access for electricity and for clean cooking. And this is the results of that study from 2017. I will tell you that while there's been a lot of progress in terms of electrification, access to electricity, there has been unfortunately very little progress when it comes to access to clean cooking. But what you see here are some of the important gains and benefits that the IEA identified that are related to providing universal access, the development benefits laid out in the bottom, for example, freeing up more time for women who spend a lot of the time in other primary gatherers of fuelwood and the like, and also the elimination of premature deaths. But what's also important in terms of the IEA's analysis is that there was an important climate benefit. Basically, they estimated in their modeling, and there are always some nuances and complexities in the modeling, but the important point here is they saw a significant reduction of 165 million tons of CO2 equivalent, basically having to do with methane and nitrous oxide, by shifting out of biomass combustion into other cleaner technologies. So the important point that I wanted to make here was we fundamentally have this intersection of three dynamics: the use of energy, development goals, and the emissions goal related to food. And as we go forward, and one thing that we're trying to do as part of this research initiative is very much to keep our focus on the interplay of these three dynamics. Now, when we think about this issue of development and developing countries, we realize that in many ways it is a surprisingly important issue, because what we see is that the consumption patterns really varies depending on the development status, and in particular the income per capita status in different countries. And that's what you see reflected in these three mini graphs, lower middle income countries on the left, in the middle, upper middle income countries, and high income countries on the right. And in particular, what we see in upper middle income countries, which would include China and Indonesia and the like, Mexico, is that over time, increasing preferences for a variety of processed foods. And so the critical point here is to recognize that rising incomes affect food consumption patterns. And as we know, and I will be discussing later on today, what we eat, what we choose to eat, has major implications in terms of emissions. But the point that I wanted to make here is, again, the relationship between development and food consumption patterns. And then this also drives into another more dynamic dimension, which is that if you remember in the previous slide, we had the low income and the middle income countries. Well, what this slide shows you are the world's population distributed across these different income groups. And in particular, most people in the world today, over 3 billion, live in lower middle income countries, which was the column to the right. And in that middle column, where we saw a rapid increase in preferences for a variety of processed foods, we have over 2.5 billion people living in those countries. So in total, we have about 5.5 billion people today who live in these middle income countries. And that's why it becomes very important to understand what's happening in terms of food preferences within these middle income countries. Advanced economies, yes, are important. Low income countries, yes, are important. But just from a population and income dynamic, understanding what's going on in these middle income countries is particularly important. And the other reason it's important is because, as we all know, we're living in a dynamic world. And one of the major changes that we're seeing is in terms of population growth. When we project in terms of what's going to happen in the next 15, 20, 25 years, as the UN has done, we see very little changes in population in advanced economies and the richer economies. We see massive increases in population in low income and middle income countries. In some ways, that reflects very much a good thing. So in addition to this expanding population in these countries, we also have seen rising incomes. Really a dramatic increase since 2000. And as I presented in the previous slide, two slides ago, what we also see is that rising incomes do have an impact on what kind of food people consume. It also has an impact on caloric intake, but I think probably at this point, we're probably seeing a bigger impact in terms of the nature of dietary preferences. And then the other point too, when we think about developing countries, is that as a general proposition, in an aggregate level, the weight, the size of developing country economies has also been surging over the last 15, 20 years. Now, these slides are presented in terms of purchasing power parity, which in some ways is really the critical issue that we're talking about when we think about food, because this really describes the ability of these populations to purchase more food. So very much living in a dynamic world when we think about the relationship between energy, food, and development. And so that leads to really a variety of final thoughts that I would like to leave you with. The first is, and it was a point I made at the beginning, and it's very important to always state and restate, which is that obviously the critical issue is how we can improve energy productivity to support food production and poverty alleviation. Energy remains a critical input into food production. We have more people, we have rising affluence, we have to do better in terms of fighting poverty. Obviously, COVID is just going to exacerbate some of the challenges we face in this regard. So we need to continue the effort of improving the ability of energy to deliver food. But also energy use, as we've also seen from some of the data, is not only key to the food system, but also in particular what is happening beyond the farm gate. So as we think about this issue of food system emissions, we need to think about energy use, and most of that energy use is taking place outside the farm gate. So we need to very much focus in that. And in that regard, we need to find opportunities for low carbon transformation in this energy use within the farm gate, but very much more so outside of the farm gate. Then a few final thoughts, which is a recognition that the world is changing. We're seeing a growing economies in the developing world, and that these increasing incomes that we're also seeing across the developing world are having an impact on food patterns and will present a different set of decarbonization challenges in the future. And that's why fundamentally what we're trying to do here is to think about not only what the world looks like today, but also the need to plan for tomorrow's world. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, both Francesco and Philip, for those great keynote talks getting us started on our food system emissions workshop. There's some nuts and bolts questions in the Q&As, and I'm going to ask Francesco and Philip to respond to those in the Q&As. But for the discussion piece, there have been a couple of questions about uncertainty, or I think this is a very major part. One of the questions was about, look, there's still uncertainty in the tier 1, those are the IPCC guidelines on how countries calculate their emissions, let alone tier 3, which is now being encouraged. So I'd like to ask both of you, how do you view the uncertainties within the estimates? Where are we in this, and how can this project help, and other projects? And as we go to the countries, you know, is this crippling for the countries, these levels of uncertainties? What do we, you know, what's this, how do we deal with these key uncertainties? So Francesco, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Philip.
Yeah, let me just, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Why don't you turn on your camera?
Yeah, I'm trying. Hold on.
And Philip, keep your camera on too. This is just a bit of a discussion until we go to our next
there we go.
set of talks. Good.
Yes. Yes, thank you. No, I did see the questions. In fact, I attempted to answer at least initially, but this is a good chance to share my thoughts directly. So, I mean, uncertainty is clearly a critical issue. Right? I mean, especially when it comes to non-CO2 gases and complex processes like the ones that we have on the farm, for example, even before we start to go on the food systems chain. So we know, for example, from IPCC that N2O emissions are very uncertain, 50 to 100% uncertain in terms of the coefficients that are used at the tier 1 level. And methane actually as the lowest uncertainty between the CO2 and the N2O, but it's still around 30 to 50%. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe I didn't mention it, but that's one of the things where we want to focus on in the characterization and the building of the database. Just to mention, maybe, for example, we do compute uncertainties when we produce the data domains in FAFSA, but we yet don't disseminate them. So this is an area where we could add in terms of deliverables from the project. So we did publish them in papers, so we don't have them in the database. Is it a problem in terms of action? I mean, or what does it mean in terms of tier 2 and tier 3? I mean, this is a very, very lengthy discussion, right? And I've seen comments of other people asking, why don't we use tier 2 and tier 3, for example? To me, the answer maybe it's two-step. The first one is, when we build a global database that we want also to use as a knowledge product, right? Where we want to compare countries in their regional differences, but also over time. Using a simple though robust, because tier 1 it's still approved by the thousands of scientists that write the IPCC guidelines, is important, so that every country is treated, it's at the same playing level field, right? And so you're able to compare dynamics and trends in a way that can be controlled. Now, having said that, I mean, it's obvious that when it comes to the nitty-gritty of then, going with the magnifying lens and seeing what's under the hood of the emissions that you quantify, then you need more detail. But I think the answer there is, when we move to actual action in countries, for example, through pilots, we will, by necessity, need to move to higher tiers. But with the idea is, for example, we do some of that now in the database. So with the idea that we compare what we've done in the simple approach with the more complicated one. And when it makes sense, when you get the most bang for your investment, then you move to the higher level analysis, I think.
Thank you, Francesco. So Philip, your thoughts on uncertainty and sort of leading to action, and how it is, but then also
Right.
there's been a couple of questions since you are the clean cooking expert. Can you very quickly answer what are the main reasons for the lack of uptake of the clean cooking methods? And there was even a question in the chat, in the Q&A about, well, what about this biofuel dung, and is that, what's its role? So, but just very quickly, because we need to get on to our next session, but want to give you a chance to answer those few questions.
Good question. Okay, thanks a lot. So two responses. First, in terms of the uncertainty in the tiers issue, fundamentally we have a problem in terms of lack of information, lack of data, when we look at what's happening in terms of the food systems. And if I could just give an illustration, there's the issue of packaging, right? When we have packaging, you require actually normally fossil fuels as feedstock for that packaging. You require fossil fuels, like for example, natural gas, to create the heat to create the packaging. In order to get that fossil fuel to the packaging site, you have production issues, you have methane leakages from production and transport when you get to the packaging point. So we really don't have enough information. There have been some studies, but really not enough to give us a sense as to what, in some sense, is the carbon intensity of that plastic packaging as it relates specifically to food packaging, because there are other forms of packaging. And that actually then becomes a critical issue in terms of figuring out, okay, what makes more sense? To actually have processed food that will last a long time, or to have fresher food that won't last as long a time and doesn't require packaging? I think in some ways we need to get a better sense as to what's happening now, but also the opportunities to decarbonize those processes to figure out what makes more sense in the future in terms of meeting, on the one hand, the development and poverty alleviation needs. Processed foods can help in some ways, but maybe they're really not the best thing when it comes to the emissions side. And that then dovetails onto the issue of clean cooking. What we've seen, interestingly enough, is that a lot of continual progress on the issue of electrification, electricity access, but not on clean cooking. And I would just, to simplify, point to two reasons. One of the reasons is because not enough has been done to really understand the interaction between the people who actually have to cook and the use of technologies, and to figure out a way to meet the needs of the people who actually have to cook. Realizing that there are certain cultural realities. How you cook in certain societies differs from how you cook in others, and that has an impact on the technologies you have. People tend to say, oh, let's just provide electricity for cooking. That doesn't always work. But I'd say the most important reason is a lack of interest, to be frank. That often, unfortunately, there's a gender dimension here as well, poor families and the like. Not enough consistent attention has been paid by policymakers to the issue of clean cooking. People love to build big power plants, or they love to talk about solar PV and high-tech solutions. Not enough thought is going into the nitty-gritty issues that you have to deal with in terms of providing clean cooking technologies to people.
Great. Well, with that, thank you, Philip. Thank you, Francesco, for leading off the workshop. Please, both of you, please immediately go to the Q&A and type your answers, because we're trying to be as interactive as possible. Hayden Montgomery from the Global Research Alliance just also gave a very key comment about use of Tier 1 methodology. So let's continue our discussion with the Q&As as well. But now I want to introduce Hun Hattersdotter, who's going to lead our next session, which is now getting even deeper into the nitty-gritty of the food system emissions. Hun is from Earth 2.0. She's coming to us from Iceland, where she's working on please introduce yourself a little bit too, Hern, but just to say she's working on a fascinating project scoping out the use of large greenhouse facilities especially in areas with excess renewable energy. So Horn, over to you. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Cynthia. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this section of the workshop where we'll be focusing on food system emissions by activity. My name is Hörn Heiðarsdóttir, and as Cynthia mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Earth 2.0, which is a nonprofit through which we're working towards a more sustainable future, including improved and more sustainable food systems. Now our work is very diverse, but as Cynthia mentioned, one of the projects we're working on is with Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, in which we're trying to study the feasibility and possible design of a gigantic greenhouse facility for Iceland. So we'd like to know if and how a country like Iceland that has plenty of resources like renewable energy and fresh water could contribute to global food security through large-scale production of various crops in greenhouses or indoor farms for global exports. Now, sustainable food production is a hot topic both in Iceland and globally these days. And in fact, attention to all aspects of the food system, production, supply chains, and consumption is growing worldwide. And in this section, we're, as Cynthia mentioned, sort of turning to the nuts and bolts of three major components that cause greenhouse gas emissions: energy use within the farm gate, transport of food, and food waste. And each of these present a major opportunity for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. We need innovation to address these and other activities within the food system to create new ways of reducing these greenhouse gas emissions. Now in this session, we have three speakers, each focusing on these three different activities that we're looking into. And in the end, after hearing their presentations, we'll have a discussion in which we'll be addressing questions from the audience. So please don't hesitate to send your thoughts or questions. Now I'm going to introduce all of our speakers and then we will just get directly to it. First, we will hear from Sally Q. She'll be talking about emissions from energy use within the farm gate. Now, Sally joined the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University as a research associate after receiving her master's degree in public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. In this role, she supports the center's inaugural fellow, David Sandelow, on the research and management of the US-China program. Her work mainly focuses on the intersection of climate change, energy policy, sustainable development, and US-China relations. She previously held research positions with the Climate Work Foundation, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and London Sustainability Exchange. After Sally, we'll be hearing from Giulio De Barros, and he'll be talking about emissions from food transport. Giulio is a second-year master's student at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, concentrating in energy and environment. He holds a Bachelor of Economics from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, with previous training in environmental science from the Federal Institute of Rio de Janeiro. Mr. De Barros has worked extensively with environmental economics, especially with policy analysis and econometrics. Prior to Columbia University, he was a research analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative, where he worked with land use and agriculture production. His research experience involves remote sensing of atmospheric pollution and fire spots in the Amazon forest, randomized control trials to evaluate the implementation of water cisterns in the Brazilian semi-arid, and of conditional cash transfer to smallholders. And then our final speaker in this session will be Kevin Carl, who will be telling us about emissions from food waste. Kevin is a consultant to the Environment Statistics Division of the FAO, where he specializes in greenhouse gas emissions from food systems. He received his Master of Public Administration degree from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, with a concentration in urban and social policy. Prior to joining FAO, Mr. Carl was an associate at the Rockefeller Foundation's Food Initiative, where he focused on boosting the prominence of food-based interventions in American healthcare systems. He has spent the bulk of his career working in food production, both as a farmer and program manager for Growing Gardens, an NGO focused on urban food security issues in the United States. And prior to working for Growing Gardens, he started 2 farming businesses, one in Canada and one in the US. And he's passionate about sustainable food production and regenerative agriculture. So I think we're ready to hear from our first speaker. Sally, are you ready?
Thank you, Horn, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for tuning into today's event. And now I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. Let's see. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Today, my presentation will be focusing on the energy use and associated emissions in agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And also, I think more generally, people will be referred to them as the emission from energy use within the farm gate. So there will be 5 main parts of my presentation. I will start by introducing the objective of the project, and then talk about where we gathered the data from and what we did with the data, and also what are some of the preliminary findings from analyzing the data. And finally, we're going to talk about what we'll be doing as next steps. So the objective of the project is to create and disseminate a data set to track the emission of 3 major types of greenhouse gas emission from energy use in agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And the data will be organized by individual country levels and by individual energy carriers / fuel types. And just to provide a little bit more clarification on the scope here, by energy use, we are referring to the consumption of a fuel product and electricity for activity directly related to agricultural and fishing activities. In other words, activities here such as pesticide fertilizer production and relevant machinery production, building construction are considered indirect activities, and is not included in our scope of analysis. And here we look at the data sources where we gather the data to create a data set. So we use data mainly from 4 different sources to get the consumption data and the relevant conversion factors of each fuel product. So as listed in the top row, we used the IPCC 2016 guideline to obtain conversion values such as emission factors of each fuel product and the net calorific value for converting fuel consumption if they're in weight or volume into energy content in terajoules. And then we look at the FALStat. So FALStat, in their agricultural data energy use domain, they already have a very similar data set that is to what we're trying to create. But the the FallStat data set is only available, has data available up until 2012. So we will be using that data set as a reference to check the data quality of our new data set. And we will also be using our new data set to expand, to update the current FallStat energy domain. And the third source is the UN data energy statistics. So it has energy consumption quantity data for each field types available between the year from 1990 to 2017 in agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And we will be using the UN data as the foundation to create our updated data set and to calculate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by each field type and also by country level. And the last but not least data source is the IEA World Energy Balances 2020 version. And the unique thing about this source is it has separate flow for fishing aside from agriculture and forestry. So in a later step, we'll be referring to the IEA data to compile a separate sub-data set for fishing activities and associated greenhouse gas emission. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, our analysis uses the UN energy statistic as a foundation, and this table created based on the UN data methodology document gives a more detailed overview of what activities are exactly included in this category. So just want to quickly show it over here. And now I'm going to talk about what we did with the data and how we put together the data set. So step one, we went to the UN data portal, and as you can see from the snippet on the left hand of the slide, so the energy statistic database is divided by different field product, and under each field product there's consumption sub data set by different type activities. So basically what we did is just to download all the sub data set of the available field types in agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and then combine them into a master database. And then step two, since most of the consumption quantity in the UN energy statistics are in weight, so we applied the net calorific value to those quantities to convert them into energy content in terajoules. And if they're already in terajoules, we just keep them as it is. And in step three, we applied the emission factors that we gather from the IPCC guideline, the tier 1 emission factors, to calculate the emission by each individual greenhouse gas type. And then in step 4, we applied the global warming potential of CH4 and N2O to calculate the CO2 equivalent emission for all type of greenhouse gas. And then in step 5, we just add all the CO2 equivalent emission together to calculate the total CO2 equivalent emission. And here on the left hand is a snippet of what the final data set look like. Then so we can see that just within the whole data set, there are 167 countries or areas being represented, and we have 39 field products in total, and the ones listed in the second columns are the one has significant shares. And is also ranked by their share of consumption within the total data set. And in terms of the elements, we have their consumption value in terajoules and the emission factors for all 3 types of greenhouse gas, and also their emission amount by their greenhouse gas emission type and the CO2 equivalent emission for all 3 type of gases. And the data covers from year 1990 to 2017. And with the data set, we did some preliminary analysis and have identified several trends of the emission by 3 categories. So first by country groups total and country group per capita, and by different energy carriers. And just one thing to know, the analysis, we excluded renewables, biofuels, and the waste products. So now we look at the total emissions by developing countries versus developed countries from year 1990 to 2017. So as we can see, as global total emission in this category, it has increased by 26.63% over the years. And within developing countries, the emission from energy use in this category increased by 149%. And in developing countries, the trend is a little bit opposite. It decreased by 44.4% over the years. So as we can see, the developing countries here is really the one that is driving the overall increasing trend of the global total energy use emission in this category. And then we look at the total emission from energy use in this category by world regions. So we can see that the only world region showing a downward trend is Europe, and its total energy use in emission from this category declined by 65.7% during this time period, while all the other world regions have various degree of increase. The most significant increase in terms of total emission occurred in Asia. And you can see from year 1992, the total emission in Asia exceeded that of Europe and became the second, and became the highest in the world. And take a closer look. This graph provides a closer look in terms of the world subregions. As we can see that the rapid growth in Asia is mainly driven by the growth in East and Southern Asia, and the decline, overall decline in the total emission in Europe is primarily driven by this line, which is Eastern Europe. And this chart shows the top 10 emitters in terms of the total emission in this category for the most recent 5 available years. And we can see China, India, United States has always been the top 3, and the 4 and 5 kind of switch between Brazil and Iran, and Russia Federation has always been number 6, and Poland and Canada switch between the 8th and 7th place, and 10th and 9th, Mexico, Turkey, and Japan. And now we shift from a total emission standpoint to a per capita perspective to look at the data. And here we see a very different story. If you look at the right-hand side chart, it shows that developed countries emit twice as much as developing countries over the years from energy use in the agriculture, forestry, and the fishing categories. And if we look at the trend by world regions, we see Europe has the highest per capita emission from energy use in this category, followed by Americas, Asia, and Africa, and the lowest is Oceania. And also by world subregion, we see the highest per capita emission in Europe comes from Northern Europe. Although it has been steadily declined between the year 2002 and 2012, it's even at its lowest point, it is still significantly higher than other world subregions. And the second highest is Latin America. It got caught up though by North America and Sub-Saharan Africa in 2013, as it shows over here. And this is a very similar table as the earlier one. Instead of showing the total emission, this one shows the top 10 countries in terms of per capita per capita CO2 equivalent emission. And we get very different story over here. As we can see, the top 3 countries are mainly in North Europe. The Faroe Islands and Greenland are both Danish territory, and then Iceland. And then we can see all from very different geographical regions in terms of per capita emission than total CO2 equivalent emission. And this is the last graph. So here we see the total CO2 equivalent emission from energy use in this category by energy carrier shares between developing countries and developed countries in only the year 2017. So from this global pie chart, we see although there are 39 total fuel products included in this data set, there are only 6 fuel products that have a considerable or noticeable share in terms of the emissions, which is electricity, fuel wood, gas and diesel oil, hard coal, motor gasoline, and natural gas. And compared between developed countries and developing countries, we realize developed countries relied more heavily on oil product and less heavily on coal and electricity. And the fuel would have very similar shares, like around 4%, 5% in both developed and developing countries. So in the next steps, we'll be focusing on 3 main areas. So one is to create a SAP data set on energy use and associated emissions for fishing activities. And 2 is to collect and calculate indirect energy use and associated emissions in agriculture and the fishing. As this table shows that the part highlighted in gray, this is the part that we have been taking into consideration with this current data set, which is from the direct fuel and the electricity consumption on farm and forestry and fishing. And then we're probably going to be looking at more indirect activities such as fertilizer, pesticide production, equipment manufacturing, as well as some of the infrastructure construction relevant part on farm. And the third area is that we're going to collect data and calculate energy use emission in other part of the food system. And this chart provides a very comprehensive view of the component and processes within a food system. As we can see, the part that I circled with red and blue is the part that included in our current step and the immediate next step. And as we can see, it's really just the very beginning and the very little part of the whole food system. So in other part, for example, we'll be looking at the energy use and emissions in food processing and packaging, refrigeration during distribution and retail, energy consumption for household and food services, for consumption and cooking activities, and etc. So with that, I will finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. So we'll just go straight to our next speaker, which is Julio de Barros, and he'll be talking about emissions from food transport. Julio, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Let me share my screen with you. Thank you, Hayden, for the introduction. Thank you, Sally, for your presentation and for your valuable inputs to this project. My topic is emissions from food transportation. I want to start with a very brief history of food, just a very quick background. Our direct ancestors spent most of the time as most of their lives as simple foragers. The first Homo sapiens bones are dated about 190,000 years before the present, and it seems that we have been hunter-gatherers for approximately 180,000 years. Only 10 to 5,000 years ago, we started developing agriculture. Many researchers ask why. We don't have the answer, but apparently it was the most of causes that made agriculture be developed independently throughout the world at the same time. Let's go forward to the first societies. The first settlements started building roads and means to communicate for military purposes, and obviously to trade food. Trade has been always very connected to food. In the major transport infrastructure, we can highlight the Roman roads that were built about 300 years before the Common Era. Then we have things that stayed more or less the same throughout Middle Ages, And we can jump to the 15th century to the spice trade navigation, mainly by Portugal and Spain, but also England, Netherlands, Italy. The main goal was to source all these new spices in the New World, but of course they had the main thing of like increasing powers, these countries' powers, right? And another major point in the Industrial Revolution, we'll see we experiment in exponential growth in population, mostly urban and industrial. Food more than ever has been transported over great distances. We have the advance of packaged food, supermarkets, in the sense that I think everyone here will agree with me that we're no longer hunter and gatherers, but we have food on our tables from an extensive and complex supply chain. This is a cartoon from a USDA publication from 1956, where the agency was trying to quantify the cost of food transportation in the US. It says, oh, the trip is getting longer. We see a train wagon, a port. And the publication was portraying food transportation as novelty. So, an anecdotal example, I drove yesterday to the supermarket in New Jersey to buy tomato sauce. We had a pasta during dinner. The sauce came from a distribution center that supplies to other 302 stores of the same chain of grocery stores. It's also produced in a facility, assume that is close to the headquarters in Monrovia, California. The processing facility received ingredients from all over the world. You know, we have tomato puree from Italy, soybean oil from Brazil, sugar from India, garlic from China, olive oil from Greece. Each of these products were transported by land, by sea, or by air from the country of origin. And if you think that in the country of origin, they will also transport between the farm, or if you also think that we can include industry, if they were processed to a distribution center, then to the port or to the airport. And if you go one step further, you see that agricultural inputs, such as fertilizers, they also need to be transported to reach the farm gate. And they come from all over the world as well, and that's a whole new cycle, right? So the key word here for us is interdependency. Our goal is to measure energy flows, which you can think also as emission flows in such a system. But then there's the problem, what is a system? What we're defining as a system? So our analysis is very, very much in line with the USDA paper report that Philip mentioned previously, which is the report by Canada. It's called Energy Use. And you consider that final demand is the output of a system. All energy entering into a system is embodied in the system's final sales of goods and services. And the system, we can think of the system as an economy. We can map this with input and output analysis, with input and output accounts. And the boundary of an input-output account is the domestic food system. For a very brief introduction to input-output analysis for those that are unfamiliar with the concept, IO maps the flow of goods and services in an economy. You see in the lines where the industry and sectors that that goods and services and also energy and pollution come from, and you can map that to in the columns. So A11, for instance, means the goods and services from industry one to industry one. Line 2, for instance, we have A21, goods and services from industry 2.1 to industry, goods and services from industry 2 to industry 1. And we can do that throughout the economy, and we can map the flow of goods and services, and we can also map energy, and we can also map emissions. We have 3 pieces of literature that apply this concept to food systems. 3 studies. One of the studies for the US, one of the studies for China, and one is for the European Union. Together, these 3 regions account for 45% of total transport in the world, energy use in total in transport in the world. For the US, we're using this paper by Kenny Reckamp, Waters, and AgMIP, which is a USDA report called Role of Fossil Fuels in the US Food Systems in the American Diet. For Europe, EU27, we're using Monforte, Ferrari, Pasqua, energy use in the EU food sector. And for China, we Song, Guidong, Tian, and Lin, the energy implications of China food system transformation. In addition to these, we're using a forthcoming paper by Kripa et al. And other authors for the rest of the world, which uses ADGAR data. So just very briefly, the paper for the US uses as year of analysis 2012. It has a broader range, but we're focusing on 2012 and energy use. For EU27, we focus on 2013, energy use and emissions. In China, 2012. So the results from these papers are in column, which I identify as 1, food transport. That's the total energy used with food transport that we can derive from each of those papers. For instance, in the US, we see that in 2012, the US, the energy used for food transport in the US was 0.8 quadrillion BTUs. Now we can also find in literature from the International Energy Agency energy balances the total transport energy use in the economy in this region, and we can calculate 1/2, that is food transport over total transport energy use, calculate this alpha, and we find the share of food transport in total transport. We can do that for the US, for Europe, and for China, and we see that alpha ranges from 3 to 7. But we have to be a bit careful analyzing those numbers to avoid comparing apples and oranges, because Europe and China include international bunkers and the US doesn't. Now, we can apply those shares to, if we know that 3.1% of energy used in total transport is food related, we can assume that the share also applied to emissions. Therefore, if the total transport emitted 1,724 million tons of CO2 in 2017 in the US, we can multiply that by 3.1%, and we find that food transport in the US in that year emitted 53 million tons of CO2. We can also do that for the EU and for China. And one step further, we can apply that alpha to historical emissions, and we're using PREMAP, which is the National Historical Emission Time Series by Kitchell and other authors, to calculate a time series of food transport emissions. And we see some results. I'm running short of time here, I'm sorry. This is a few results. We have food transport due to emissions, breakdown by continent. We see that Europe is somewhat flat. Then we have the Americas increasing slightly, but nothing compared to in Asia. We also see Africa catching up, and Oceania mostly flat. A good analysis is also comparing OECD countries to low-income food deficit countries and net food important developing countries. And also Annex 1 countries with proxy for industrialized countries to non-Annex 1 countries, which is they're also catching up. This is the last slide. Our analysis needs some refinement because we need also to apply year-specific shares. We're using a single alpha per country. Now we need to apply our year-specific share. That is to capture yearly components, like things that change throughout years in transportation in each country. We need also to include more refined country-specific IO analysis. So far, we only have analysis for 3 regions. And we need to refine by mode of transport and understand better the role of international trade. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio, for this presentation. And now it's for our last speaker of this section, Kevin Carl. Are you with us?
Hello, Horn. Hello, everybody. I will share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes, but you're on presenter view, so just to swap displays on the top. Well,
Okay, let me do that one more time. Excuse me. How is it now, Eric?
yeah, that looks good.
Okay, great. So hello, everybody. Thank you to the AgMIP community for being here. I'm eager to present on some initial research and preliminary results on greenhouse gas emissions from food systems waste disposal. So first, it's important to define exactly what I mean when I talk about food systems waste disposal. So there's a lot of ways to think about food loss and waste. As Alexander et al. Show in 2017, you can consider food loss and waste from unharvested and crop residues all the way through to the overconsumption of food. But what I am estimating emissions from is after food reaches consumers and it is disposed, what are the emissions that come from those different disposal streams? So there are 4 main streams of food systems waste emissions. There is solid food waste disposed to landfills and open dumped. There's domestic wastewater, including sewage, latrine, septic, treated and untreated systems. Industrial wastewater for food processing, but also including pulp production used for food packaging, and incineration of plastic and rubber disposed in landfills used in food systems. I should say here that what this does not include, as Philip mentioned earlier, is the energy that's used in managing waste disposal systems. That'll be a next step. So starting with solid food waste represents the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions of the 4 in CO2 equivalents. And I will start by describing the model I'm using to estimate methane emissions from food waste in dumps and landfills. So the basic steps of this model are, it takes as input data the World Bank's What a Waste Report 2.0, which I'll get into in a moment. And then I model time series data using GDP growth over time, and I'll explain the relationship between GDP and GDP per capita and food waste per capita, and then basically applying IPCC methodology in the 2019 refinement. So for input data, I mentioned the World Bank's What a Waste 2.0 report contains country level data in 2016 for total municipal solid waste, and also very usefully has for each country the percentage of that waste that is food and green waste. And so in this model, we assume that the food and green waste is predominantly food systems waste. And then in the IPCC 2019 refinement, there is data, country level data on the fraction of waste disposed to landfills, open dumped, and incinerated. So to create a time series using the What a Waste report as a starting point is important to determine the nature of the relationship between GDP and food waste. So there's already been some good research on this. Xue et al. In 2017 found that through a meta-analysis of food waste publications, that food waste does tend to grow over time along with GDP per capita, but tends to level off. The one limitation in this report was that this data is predominantly from higher income countries, and some lower income countries were represented, but not many. So to build on this, I used the World Bank report to find the relationship between GDP and food waste for the countries listed in those report. And that data set is more complete in terms of solid waste data and food waste data for lower income countries. And the findings are similar. Food waste here increases rapidly with GDP and then begins to level off over time. So basically it's a logarithmic function or logarithmic correlation, which means that the percentage change in GDP per capita is actually more significant, has a stronger relationship with food waste than a unitary increase in GDP per capita. And so I use this finding to essentially backcast the 2016 data from the World Bank report using the logarithmic function of GDP per country. And this is the resulting curve of the world solid food waste total. And I'll present this finding in more detail later. But you can see it grows and with GDP as GDP has grown over this time, but tapers off. So the IPCC model, waste model to estimate methane from landfills is essentially a first order decay model for methane. Fortunately, there are food specific coefficients in the 2019 refinements that I could use. And there are also, I estimated country specific decay constants depending on climate, both temperature and also moisture. So you can see here, these are not the K values that I used as the decay constants, but this graph can show the difference between the decay constants you would get in wet conditions versus arid conditions, and that's predominantly because the more fraction of the food waste that's anaerobic, that will produce more methane. So the wetter, the more methane. And then the IPCC default values I used were country level input data is lacking, such as waste site specific factors. And that's kind of tier 1. So that's solid food waste. For domestic wastewater, I estimated methane and nitrous oxide. Using as input data, country-specific per capita biochemical oxygen demand and inventory year, that is from the IPCC. And then calculated emissions factors separately for rural, urban high income, and urban low income. And there are tier 1 emissions factors for different kind of waste streams, so septic, latrine, sewer, and untreated. Also considering the amount of organic matter to be removed as sludge in, for instance, a sewer system. And then for nitrous oxide, I use country-specific per capita protein consumption. That is also from IPCC, and the amount of protein that is not consumed per country that is disposed to sewers in countries that actually allow for food disposal in sewage systems. And similar calculations separately for fraction of population that is rural, urban high, and urban low income, and specific emissions, tier 1 emissions factors for different waste fates. For industrial wastewater, I also estimated methane and nitrous oxide from food system industrial processes. The input data here is from a combination of sources. The UN Industrial Commodity Statistics data has historical data in different categories, and so does FAOSTAT for food production. And then to estimate how much pulp production is being used in food systems, I use the food system share of total waste for each country that was present in the World Bank report as a proxy for the food system's share of pulp production in those countries. Then I applied IPCC emissions factors per industry type and used OECD data on wastewater treatment as a proxy for the percent of industrial water that's treated over time for each country. So for instance, these are some different industrial processes or categories for food processing, beer and malt, fish processing, vegetables, fruits, and juices. And the IPCC has data on wastewater per ton of product, as well as nitrogen, kilograms of nitrogen per volume of wastewater and degradable organic carbon for volume of wastewater. And finally, incineration, basically using IPCC methodology just to calculate the CO2 that comes from burning plastic and rubber per country, and similarly employing the food system share of total waste as a proxy for the food system share of plastic and rubber waste used per country. So some preliminary results. Using the second assessment report coefficients, you can see the coefficients here, just over 1 gigaton in total waste and equivalents, CO2 equivalents. Most of it comes from solid food waste. Incineration appears to be negligible. This is per continent. So Asia predominantly followed by the Americas. And then in terms of top 10 emitting countries, not too much of a surprise, countries with the highest populations, China, India, United States, Brazil. But if you look at these same countries in emissions per capita, food waste emissions per capita, you see that these are the top 10 net emitting countries. So the ones from here. So Mexico actually has the highest per capita emissions, and India has the lowest. And then finally, just to take the top 10 emitting countries in CO2 equivalents per capita, you have very different countries than were previously represented, except for Mexico is also on this list. So those are some preliminary findings from my food waste emissions modeling research, and glad to discuss further in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kevin, Sally, and Julio. There have been some questions in the Q&A, and they are being answered. But we do have some time for some discussion right now. It's good to get into sort of the technical details here. And so it's obviously a good step in bridging the gap of uncertainties, especially in the post-Farmgate. But obviously there are still some gaps to bridge the full picture. But I wanted to ask all of you for the activities each of you have been exploring. Was there anything surprising in your findings? And how do you think these findings either support or contradict previous assumptions on these activities? Maybe starting with you, Kevin.
It's a good question. I think one interesting finding for me was the relationship between GDP and food waste. I think some previous models have used population to estimate food waste, or look at the correlation between population and the amount of food waste deposited per capita, which didn't really add as much nuance as I think using GDP does. And so, building on previous findings and then doing some original research to corroborate that relationship, I think could be used in a number of fields to highlight the importance of, looking at food waste in higher income countries specifically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sally and Julio, do you want to contribute?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll share some of my surprising findings. So first, I think one thing really, like the contract of the result really struck me is the difference between, like when you look at in terms total carbon dioxide equivalent emission and the per capita carbon dioxide emission. And I think this contract is due to the population growth recently in Asia and in Africa, and in like a lot of the developing countries around the world. Because as we see, like the total like emission like in developing world hasn't been like really changed over the years, and in Europe it even like declined a little bit affected. But if you look at the population, their population has stayed pretty consistent as well throughout the years. You know, with the technology advancement, and when you take all those considerations, like all those factors into consideration, it's not very surprising to see now there's a contrast between a per capita perspective and a total emission perspective. And one thing really surprised me is that I found Poland is on both of the top 10 chart of total emission basis and on the per capita basis. So I think it's just some very interesting finding that I want to put it out there. A very unique country, Poland. And then one thing also like related to some of the questions that I see in the Q&A, people has been asking why there's such a large share of electricity use in agriculture, forestry, and fishery in developing countries. And I just digged a little bit deeper into the data set. So I found out like the high percentage of energy use in this category is mainly from Asia, like most notably like in China and India, very large of the electricity use in agriculture, and it also contributed a lot to the emission. I think has to do with the fact both countries are really heavily relied on coal. For example, China, 60% of the electricity is still generated by coal every year. And there was also one question that was asking what do people use electricity to do in agriculture? And I haven't really looked very into detail about separate activities in terms of each fuel product consumption, but I can share the information that involves that there's a subcategory for electricity consumption is for power irrigation. So I think that's a very significant source for electricity consumption. And also like just looking at livestock and animal productions, I believe ventilation and space heating is also a very large part of electricity consumption.
Right, thank you. Julio, do you have anything?
Yes, what was really surprising for me was, was analyzing all this data, and lots that I showed you, see like a surge in Asia, and of course we always have to, first thing if we want to blame one or another country, and well, like okay, this is certainly China, because China has been growing a lot, and then you go to see like China contribution is not that large. It's actually contribution is majorly from middle income countries, and that's the same applies in the America. Like not only the U.S. is a large pollutant, but also a lot of middle income countries in the Americas are polluting as well a lot, because maybe infrastructure gaps that we need to close because they are developing, etc. So this is something that it is surprising, and it also shows that perhaps if you increase efficiency, you can transport food, you can transport a lot of food, but you're not necessarily polluting a lot if you do that efficiently.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention and discuss maybe a little bit mitigation opportunities. Now, for these three different activities, where can we do better and how, now that we have some preliminary findings of bridging this gap?
I mean, one clear finding here, and it doesn't add too much to what people already understand about food waste, but it's really hard to dispose of food waste in a way that doesn't have environmental impacts and emit greenhouse gases. So just limiting waste in the first place, more attention needs to be paid there. You know, other research has come out in the recent years about even composting and you know, digestion facilities. There's remote sensing over these piles showing that a lot of methane still comes off of these systems as well. So reduction of waste needs to be doubled down on from my perspective.
Thank you.
And I would like to offer my answer from two perspectives. One, just in terms of agriculture, I believe right now, like smart agriculture technology has been discussed and being deployed in many countries. So I think just from the agricultural perspective, make the productivity higher, efficiency higher is important, while it's also important to take into consideration of the synergy between, you know, production, efficiency, and the nutrition quality of the food, as well as environmental impact. So balancing between the 3 points while, you know, working on improving the efficiency. And a second perspective is more from a systematic perspective. As I just mentioned, like the electricity consumption and the electricity generation very heavily from coal, I think is a very big contributor to the total emission. So I think just overall, like clean energy transition and clean energy technology in like those very highly like emitted countries, I think those are important as well.
Right. Giulio, do you want to contribute?
Yes, I'd like again to stress the importance of efficiency, especially coming. I'm from Brazil. Brazil is extremely productive in agriculture. Although, if you check our roads and our infrastructure, it's a very, very poor infrastructure that we have. So we're very efficient within the farm gate, but after the farm gate, we need like to transport the food that we produce in the farm, the agricultural inputs that we use in industry, through unpaved roads, etc., by trucks, and that's extremely, extremely unproductive. That's extremely that pollutes a lot, right? It emits a lot of GHG gases. So if we can close that gap of infrastructure and coming with more efficient ways of transporting food, we cannot break the supply chain that we built so far. This is incredible. We have strawberries during the summer and during the winter. We have strawberries from the U.S. being imported to Brazil and also being exported to China. I don't think no one wants to break that, but we want to make things more efficient.
Thank you, Giulio. I think we're out of time for now. So I just want to thank you all for participating in the Q&A. There are some more technical questions there that I hope you guys will answer. So thank you very much. And let's get on to the next session.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Cynthia.
Thank you very much, Horn, for leading that session and moderating, and for the very interesting questions and answers at the end. Presenters, Sally, Giulio, and Kevin, who are as you can tell, the line researchers who are working day and night to make the project move forward. I want to now introduce a principal in the project, David Sandalo, who was the founding fellow of the Center of Global Energy Policy at the School for International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He has a very distinguished career previously at the State Department. He knows all the ins and outs of the negotiations at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And it's so that I hope what David's going to now share is about the policy aspects of the project. And you'll be able, I hope, to really see that we are not just doing technical, not just doing policy, but that we are really working together to integrate those two from the beginning, which I think is this key ingredient, sort of the key recipe for leading to action. So David's going to give a short introduction now to policy. Then we're going to go to the breakout groups, so be deciding which one you want to go to. So that then we can further the discussion and really engage with the participants. But David, but first, David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you to, all the speakers have gone before me who are doing such interesting, important work. I really am just thrilled to see the progress that everyone's making on the data side of this project. And I'm going to talk about our work on policy options, which, as Cynthia said, is really pretty fundamental, because we want to make sure that the research we're doing has an impact and leads to change. And I'm going to start with just a discussion of what are called nationally determined contributions under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And some of you might be very familiar with this if you work in the climate diplomacy world, and if so, my apologies for the basic introduction. Some of you might not know anything about it, so let me just take a moment to describe what they are. That's kind of diplomatic lingo for national climate action plans, and it's really at the heart of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement requires every country that's a party, which is almost every country in the world, to submit a national climate action plan. It's called an NDC every 5 years. And that's really, it's one of the core requirements. The 5-year cycle is upon us, and the updated NDCs, or climate action plans, are due by next November 2021, which is the 26th Conference of the Parties. That's going to be held in Glasgow. Some countries have already started submitting NDCs, but most countries have not yet submitted or prepared them. Only 3.6% of total global emissions have been submitted so far. Very good work was done recently by a German think tank called Climate Focus and World Wildlife Fund and UNEP, looking at the extent to which food systems are mentioned in the current NDCs. And it's really very striking. Agriculture is mentioned in 90% of the NDCs. But after that, anything in the food system receives relatively little attention. Livestock, as you can see, receives only 50%. That is, and what that means is 50% of the NDCs mention livestock in some way, 50% do not even mention the topic. And we go all the way down to some topics we were just discussing: food waste, sustainable diets. There's not a single nationally determined contribution that was submitted 5 years ago there's about 180 countries submitted. There's not a single one mentioned food waste as part of their climate action plans. So we think this is a big opportunity. The Paris Agreement provides a mechanism to encourage governments to address these issues in the short term. Governments are going to be developing NDCs in the next 3 to 9 months, and incorporating some actions, or at least some reference to food systems, could have big impacts. Okay, why isn't it that advancing? There we go. So here we've started to analyze some policy options. Of course, others have looked at this at length as well, and I'll just start to identify some categories of those options. First, there's a whole basket of options related to climate smart agriculture. And these, to some extent, are already in some NDCs, but there's so much more that can be done with these. And that includes efficient input use, soil carbon management, livestock management, ecosystem conservation, and more. There's a lot to be done to promote energy efficiency throughout the food system, and Philip Benoit was talking about this. Sally is talking about this within the farm gate. And that is including in transport and cooking and cooling. Energy use is universal throughout the food system, and there are targeted ways that we can improve energy efficiency within the food system that could make a big difference. A third way that we can focus on is reducing food waste. As I just said, there's not a single NDC that mentioned that to date. This is a topic that has started to get more attention in the past several years, with some jurisdictions around the world starting to adopt policies related to food waste. The most striking and interesting, in my view, is what's happening in China right now, where President Xi Jinping has a campaign against food waste. And it's motivated by a number of different factors. But it's a campaign that's underway, and I think it'd be very interesting to see what impact that has and the extent to which it spreads globally. A fourth area is encouraging plant-rich diets that improve health while cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and there's various tools for doing that, national nutritional guidelines, procurement policies by governments that buy a lot of food for various purposes can make a big difference here. And the analysis strongly suggests that plant-rich diets are not only better for nutrition, but also can play a significant role in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. This could be an extremely potent way to achieve a number of different goals. Labeling food products with life cycle greenhouse gas emissions can make a difference in some places where publics are particularly focused on these issues. We've seen nutritional labeling in food make a difference in terms of consumer awareness and purchasing patterns, and labeling food products with life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in Europe and some parts of North America, some other places around the world where there's high attention to climate change as a public policy issue, I think can make a big difference. And then providing universal access to clean cooking technologies is another area that has opportunities. This is something that Philip Benoit spoke to earlier. So we are, as part of this project, have a map under development, which is going to be online. It's not final yet, but our notion is to provide a resource that anyone can use that's looking at food system emissions policies, gathering up data on the NDCs, data on dietary guidelines, data on agricultural emissions policies, and just kind of allow anyone to drill down, look at a particular country. Here we picked out Ecuador, and see what's happening there. And last slide here, I think from my perspective as a policy analyst, one attribute of this topic that strikes me is how many different dimensions food system measures touch. Measures that reduce greenhouse gases, in many cases, can also improve human health, improve human livelihoods, help protect biodiversity, and help protect animals and improve animal welfare. And I don't work on many issues that have benefits in 5 different areas. So I think it's a pretty exciting area. Thanks very much for listening. Appreciate it, and look forward to the discussion further in the breakout groups.
Great, thank you, David. All right, we are now going to go to our breakout groups. First, we'd like to pull up. Okay, we have 2 things to do. One is Eric is going to. One is going to, we have 2 things I think to do. One is to bring up the breakout questions, so which are generic ones across all groups, but the groups are quite different. And I thought maybe Matt can, if I pull them up, maybe Matt can speak to them. And then Eric needs to tell everybody how you get to your breakout group. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the slide that has that at the end of my presentation. And let's see if we can get there. Yes, Matt, can you go ahead and, because Matt is the moderator for the breakout groups, and he'll be moderating the report backs right before 4 o'clock.
Sure thing. Thanks, Cynthia. So we're about to break into 3 different breakout groups. Each one of them has a moderator and a rapporteur. And the moderator is going to moderate the discussion of these 3 questions, and the rapporteur is going to take notes to present 2 or 3 minutes of content when we all meet back in this same room again after the breakout sections. So during the breakout sessions, we're going to discuss 3 questions pertaining to everything that we've seen so far and the topic of your breakout session. We've been discussing mostly filling in knowledge gaps in the science so far, and we want to have a bit more of discussion about how this can be done further and how to apply these knowledge gaps to the policy realm. So the first question we want everyone to discuss are what are key data and modeling gaps and how can they be filled? Largely gleaning from the discussions you've seen so far today. Second, in what ways are policies currently lagging behind the broad scientific knowledge? And 3, to bring these 2 things together, what are innovative ways of addressing knowledge gaps and policy needs that can inform policymakers and other stakeholders, and I would say include stakeholders as well. So with that, Eric is going to give us instructions about how to break out into our respective rooms.